Karen Berger phoned me up, and it was a shared phone in the flat that I was staying in with a bunch of people. And the phone was in the hallway, and suddenly Karen Berger's on and said, "You're rich." And so we've got $1 a copy, and it sold 120,000 copies in the first day. And suddenly, oh, this was great. I was able to buy a house and do stuff and go around the world several times, because I took David Bowie's advice, and he said, if you ever get money, go around the world. If you ever get money. So...
Hi everyone, I'm Billy and welcome back to Half the Picture. Coming up this time, we have part 2 of my conversation with the one and only Grant Morrison. If you guys tuned into part 1, you'll know that Grant came on the podcast primarily to talk about All-Star Superman, their comic with Frank Quitely, which was a huge influence on James Gunn's latest movie. As I say, if you listen to part 1, you'll know that we span off into all sorts of weird and wonderful areas. And I'm pleased to say there's much more where that came from coming up in part 2. There are all sorts of areas that I've wanted to ask Grant about for years, and we dived well into them in part 2 of this conversation, including their Kathmandu alien abduction experience in the 1990s, which has always fascinated me, their strangest fan encounter that they've ever had, which actually, if you can believe it, happened in my hometown of all places. I know, crazy, right? And last but not least, their upcoming Batman and Deadpool comic due out in November, which is really exciting. I'm really excited about that one. I'd also just like to take the opportunity to say thank you to all you guys, everyone who's commented on episode 1 of the podcast and who has been engaging with the podcast online. It's been so positive and so full of love for, the interview and for Grant's work and for Grant themselves. And it's really humbling to put something out that you guys seem to be really enjoying. So I can't wait to share more with you. And there's going to be some great stuff coming up, I promise. So on that note, without further ado, let's roll on part 2 of my conversation with Grant Morrison. Enjoy. A lot of what you just said there reminded me of, because your experience in the 90s when you went to Kathmandu and sort of assailed the Shwaibanaf temple, which you write about very eloquently in Supergods, about how you had this almost kind of like extraterrestrial contact or a high dimensional contact. And I mean, from this experience, you were able to view life on Earth as being this singular object that is sort of barreling towards this some kind of like adult maturity point, and that when it becomes adult, we all should kind of be ready for it. It's kind of, which I think, so something that you touched on there was, I kind of reflected back on what you just said, I think, about how we're reaching this point of sophistication. And, and when's it going to come? We don't know. But when it does come, it will kind of become the individual kind of dissolved, and the sort of singularity of like, and of life on Earth and the human race will kind of be the main thing. I mean, I've always been fascinated by that story and about how, for one thing, it made me want to go straight to Kathmandu and run up the temple myself. I mean, have you ever had people come up to you and go, "Oh yeah, I ran up I went up those steps. I did the same thing." Have you ever had anyone share that experience with you that have done the same thing, followed in the footsteps of?
No, there was one kid who was read The Invisibles. Michael was his name, but he actually went and did the whole thing. He did the most amazing journeys, and there was a couple other ones who wound up actually at the feet of Buddhist monks and things. So they did a lot more than me. But yeah, there was a couple of kids, but nobody ever said they'd run up the stairs. My friend Ulrich, who we did it together, he says that we didn't run up the stairs at all, and I'm talking bullshit. So I don't know.
Well, there's this idea that occurred to me when I was reading that segment again in the book about how you talk about it a lot in your work. It's really filtered through into your work and stuff like The Invisibles and New X-Men as well. The kind of the idea of kind of this higher dimension where like our world and our universe has kind of grown in a kind of embryonic state in sort of time that's created by these sort of higher dimensional beings or alien intelligences. And time, like Shakespeare, is around one corner, and then like just around another fold in the sort of time stream is the dinosaurs, and it's all happening in this sort of object, this kind of thing. Very interesting stuff. And I was thinking like, there's an idea of like time being simultaneous, which I know has come up. I think you've talked about it a little bit in your work, and also people like Alan Moore has talked about it a lot actually, in things like Watchmen with Dr. Manhattan and Jerusalem. I mean, and that's an idea of the universe that sort of time is simultaneous, and so but a kind of eternalistic idea. But that kind of the thing that sort of fascinates and disturbs me about that idea is the idea that like, okay, so all time is simultaneous, therefore like everything has already happened. Like everything that's happened will happen, and there's a sort of cyclical thing. And where do we fit into that? Where do human beings fit into that? And I remember as sort of another sort of name I sort of became familiar with through Supergods was Peter J. Carroll, the scientist and chaosologist. He's brilliant in his book, The Apophenion, and how humans, which is all about how humans see meaning. and everything, and the idea of this sort of eternalistic notion of time, but he was very honest and like, yeah, it's useful in terms of if you are doing science or physics, but like on a human level, it's so disturbing. It's like there's no free will, there's no control. It's just like we're just going along a road, and the road is mapped out both front and back. And I think reading your book, it was like it seemed to present almost maybe a similar notion of time, or like, I mean, and we live in a world that's so rationalistic and so scientific, and like so many scientists say, oh yeah, free will, it's a fallacy. It's, determinism is the way. I mean, I guess I was curious to ask, like, as someone who has dabbled and sort of explored these ideas, I mean, what are your thoughts and feelings about that sort of, the notion of free will and the notion of sort of self-determination in a sort of wider, through your sort of experience of the world and I guess the universe and its ideas?
Just that it didn't really matter to me, I mean, but as long as I felt that I had free will, surely that was enough. If that's what I wanted, and I'm not even necessarily sure. It's hard to say you've got free will. I was born in a certain place because of decisions my parents made. I did certain things because of certain social and economic pressures that were placed on me. How much of that is me forced into a shape, and how much of that is me making free will choices? Because I don't have the choice to take a potion and become a superhero. My free will would allow me to fly to Pluto and back tonight, but it doesn't. So you start coming down a sliding scale of what your free will is allowing you to do. And it suddenly becomes, it's like a quantum thing. It becomes meaningless at a certain scale. It's like, well, who cares? I'm doing what I do, and whether I'm fitting into something. But my feeling is, yeah, we are part of a bigger organism, in the way that a skin scale is part of a bigger organism, and the sense of eternity and immortality that people feel within them, and maybe feel a religious sense of, is the mitochondria. It's the mother cell. It's the cell that has been dividing through human bodies since 3.5 billion years ago, and through all living things, and it's the same single cell dividing. And so if it sees time the way I do, then it's the connected superorganism that we're all just parts of, and we are different expressions of, and more elaborations of, that are good at certain things. And we're really good at sensing and bringing back data and information. We're also good at making prostheses. So I imagine the next thing is we bolt AI onto that, and then you've got a natural consciousness, and you've suddenly got a synthetic consciousness meeting with humans in the middle. And anything goes, it could be war, it could be, fight, fuck, or flee. That will be the decision. But I kind of think we've set in motion things that are almost inevitable. So in that, does free will fit? No. My vision showed that there's a higher dimensional space. And I think there's enough scientific evidence for that. And also for me, the metaphor of the comics was really helpful, because I can hold a comic and look through an entire character's timeline back and forward from a higher dimension. They couldn't. They were stuck on the flat page experiencing time the way they'd been written. But I could see time from above, and I could look at the end. I couldn't warn them because they were trapped in a predetermined track, but I could know. So I kind of saw, well, there's no reason to doubt there could be something above that, where somebody was manipulating me or some way. So yeah, that experience in Kathmandu was like that. And I think a lot of people have had similar experiences. So to me, it's like, yeah, when you're describing these similar versions of time, it's because people have seen something that they've tried to bring back. It's like seeing that, oh my God, the sky is blue. And all of us are just saying the sky is blue. These are not necessarily theories. I think people are trying to interpret something they've actually experienced. So, and for me, the actual experience was of higher dimensional life forms who had access to, they said, we have time, we've got space, time, we got all the stuff you've got, but we've got these other things that you don't, that you can scarcely imagine, and not to bring back as much as you can. And they tried to explain that the universe was a made thing. It was like they made it. It was because time within their world, this is what time was, like soil. So it was a plant pot almost. And they would put their children in there, larvae, is what it was explained, because only in time can larvae grow. I'm like, why can't you just split off? But there was this whole process, and it was happening in dimensions beyond me, or at a level of understanding I just couldn't match. But it just seemed like a really elegant notion, the idea of things putting something in time in order to grow that thing, and they put it on a planet like Earth, where the thing would have all the nutrients and the stuff it needed next to the sun, and so it would grow. And I didn't know if there was other ones in the universe, or if the whole universe had been made for us, if the whole universe was smaller than it looks from here, and it's hard to decide. But yeah, the space-time object in which they grew us, the living biota of the planet Earth, which is connected on the mitochondrial scaffold. It was like it was a cradle for this thing. They'd implanted it in there, and that was the only place it could grow. And like I say, it was growing into us. And the idea was, as you said, bring me back to this long-winded planetary life cycle. So this thing then that is us comes to a point where it wakes up, like a caterpillar wakes up as a butterfly. It's changed state. So this larval entity, which is the mitochondrial thing with us hanging off the tree, would wake up to some unitary consciousness. And that seemed to me a bit kind of hippie, like, oh, so we're going to chant Kumbaya and suddenly the light will come on. But what we're actually approaching is a technological reality of that people are getting close to putting something, contacting kids' brains that will allow them to create a telepathic net. And once there's a telepathic net, they're exchanging thought, and they're exchanging thought with AI at the same time. So like I say, repeating it again, consciousness will change quite radically at that point, and that's without any planetary wake up, the thing realizes it's a butterfly. No, it's going to wake up as some kind of cyborg thing, like these 5-dimensional creatures who look like morphing Quicksilver, and where I presume part machine, part thought, part, there was lots going on with them, and the structure was very fractal. So as a mad notion, I'm quite attached to it because it makes a lot of sense, and it gave me a storyline to hang the Invisibles on. But was it real? Yeah, only real in the sense that it absolutely changed me, and maybe through reading the Invisibles, it gave some other people some ideas. Is it real? I think to the extent that everyone who's had the experience describes something similar, but it's always through the nervous system. You always interpret it differently. So that's like art. You have an experience, and the way I paint is different from the way Terence McKenna paints, but there's enough in there that I recognise we're trying to paint the same thing.
Like the blind man and the elephant, sort of every single sort of interpretation of experience is on some level truthful and valid.
And I think is necessary even to understand anything of complexity. It's why I think the only way to understand any idea is to see all the angles, and even the ones you disagree with, because then you start to get a feel for the shape and the scope and the outline of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was a very empowering sort of idea to come across in the book, and how you talk about a kind of the human project and how that's and there's something so positive and optimistic about that view of the world and of humanity, really. I mean, because it's a view, I feel like it's a phrase that I've not heard too often in, outside of that, which I think is a great shame. And I think it was very empowering, the idea that if we emphasize our creativity, and I guess what we can have maybe some kind of extent of control over, there's that proverb about, give me the sort of serenity to recognize what I can change, what I can't, and the serenity, I guess, to tell the difference. And I guess what we can change is, I guess, on a personal level, is what we can bring to the world, what we can create, like the stories we can tell. But if we emphasize these sort of more positive, rational qualities, I mean, that was just that. Yeah, it was very empowering. And
well,
very.
I mean, again, think about the world we're in now. That the narrative is kind of like, we're to blame for climate crisis. We're to blame for everything. So everyone's stressed and anxious and trying to do stuff, but it's because we're constantly told it's our fault. When in actual fact, it's the fault of the people who created these crises. Again, people with loads of money and few morals. So we're always getting the blame. And in actual fact, as you say, it's way more important to just think, what can I do? So you can't save the world. Most of us aren't in a position to save the world or even major parts of it, but within our own part of the world, we do our best to be kind, to look after things, to to make things better, to try to help the environment, help people, help animals. And that's kind of your thing, you do it as far as you can. If you're writing, you try and spread ideas that hopefully will make people feel a bit better to do the same kind of thing. To me, I guess that's the value of the network, and it's less about the star idea, because I'm getting way away from this notion of the individual and the star and getting into becoming a part of a node in a network, and everyone's sharing information, everyone's sharing cool ideas. I can pass out some wild notion of mine and somebody else picks up on it, and suddenly they've got an idea, and using that in a positive way instead of it's all about who can steal whose ideas for money. more about how do these things interrelate? How can someone else take this and develop it to make something really useful out of it? You know, so again, it's for me, my access to the wider culture is through comics or through a Superman, because Superman's such a big cultural symbol. I can reach quite a lot of people through that. So it felt incumbent upon me to then have a message that was useful and positive. The same thing with the Super Gods book. Here's my chance to talk to people about a big subject that, you know, that they'll be familiar with, the superhero, and relate it to my life, and then try and again say, well, where does this take us? If we went that direction, would this be useful? Would this be helpful? Would it get us out of the mire a little bit? And hopefully that's the best you can do.
Totally. Well, I mean, for me, that is, as someone who was on the receiving end of that, it really, you know, I felt like it worked. You know, it was very, because it, like I say, it was very empowering to read, and it made me, and inspired that same thing in me. So yeah, I must say thank you. You know,
so it's pass it on, just pass the feeling on, not necessarily the book, but you can do that if you want. But just pass it on, you know, and other people feel good and want to pass it on.
Totally. There's I've got one last question about Super Gods specifically, which is you describe it. So like I said earlier, I mentioned it that I'm from Sheffield originally, up in Yorkshire. So, and you describe an account. There's a whole segment of the book where you describe like the optimum sort of like bizarre fan encounter that you've ever had, which was in the late 80s in Sheffield. And I started reading this. Yeah, and there's someone as a kid who was reading this I was like, it's like you were talking about everything, and it's suddenly like, shit, my town is in this as well. Like, what's this? You know, you know, I was wondering, like, could you talk a little bit about that, and kind of what was it about that encounter that was like so memorable? I guess what was it about?
It was uncanny. It's what made it so memorable, you know. And I always feel that chapter in Supergods I don't think really fits, and it's quite mean, you know. I was trying to be witty and cruel, I think, and it was a bit too much. But yeah, that was a strange day, you know. And as I say, we had a bunch of 5 guys were the only people who turned up, and they just stood there. They were obviously very shy or very well mannered in some way. It was strange. But they didn't know what to do because it was such a small bunch of people, and so they would approach one by one, and they were all very different. It was like, honestly, it was a Harry Potter casting call. It was like one big guy with a Hagrid kind of style, the gentle giant, lovely guy, and another tiny kind of man who was really, you know, a very self-possessed, kind of confident person. So they all had these weird, like, character traits, and it looked like a lineup, and we were just facing them, and we must have looked like a crappy lineup as well of ex-convicts. So the whole atmosphere was quite strange, and it was this kind of people coming forward, and they were trying to be, you know, that was it. And we'd signed everything there was to sign within 3 minutes. And suddenly we were there for another hour. So the whole thing just had a very weird atmosphere, and that was the strange thing about it. And when we came out, there's this little guy just coming down the street, and he platform shoes. He looked like he'd come from the 70s of this whole thing. He's going, "I've just been to Barbados, I have." And it was like, yeah, no way. He goes, "You fucking Tory bastards."
I can attest that is how we talk up in
Well, no, that was how he
well,
talked. I mean,
very good. Very good. What else again?
but yeah. So it was the air of the uncanny, and everybody had been hired and dressed up in costumes just to freak us out. But no, I love Sheffield. Like Graham Fellows, one of my favourite singer-songwriters, is from John Shuttleworth and Jilted John.
Jilted John, yeah. Well, here's a connection there. Like, so I went to, like I say, born and raised in Sheffield. I can absolutely see reading that chapter was like the biggest, like, oh yeah, I know this. I've done this inside out. This is the world I see. These people, these characters, because yeah, Sheffield, yeah, every city has its characters, but Sheffield has some great characters just like that. And Graham Fellows and Jilted John, like he came to my school to give the sort of keynote speech in graduation to it. So we're sitting there, like, you know, like ready to be giving us certificates to say, okay, you finished school, you can go up into the world now. And Graham Fellows, Jilted John himself, was giving this delivery. And I only heard about him initially. This sounds like heresy for a Sheffielder, but I heard about him through Supergods. So yeah, and I went up to, and I sort of checked how Jilted John and like the characters he did and all that stuff, and went to see him live. And so I went up to shake his hand after the speech and said, you know, you're in this book. He was completely taken. He was like, you're in this book about superheroes? And he was like, what? And you couldn't believe it. Yeah, I just told him, but yeah, you're in there a few times. You know, it was great. And I think he was really flattered and kind of surprised. But
no, I still love him. I still listen to his stuff.
Fantastic. And I mean, like I said, I could go on for hours talking to you, right? There's so much to touch on. I mean, and we touched on so many of it already. I mean, but you mentioned something in that last bit. You talked about the individual, about sort of the idea of the star and the sort of and also like the nepo baby, but like the privilege, but also, but the keyword there, I guess, is star, celebrity, and you and famously collaborated with Robbie Williams. 20 years ago, touching on stars, you collaborated with him 20 years ago, you and Frank Whiteley, on his album Intensive Care, because that is such an interesting sort of chapter in the sort of in the story of like your career. Like, well, what was that experience like working with, like, how did Robbie Williams get in touch with you to say, oh yeah, was he a big comics fan? Was he like, oh, we need to do this album together?
He sent an email and we weren't convinced, so I kind of wrote back very neutral and asked some questions to see if it was really him. But it was really him, and he wanted me to teach him about magic. He was very interested in the occult and aliens and all that stuff. I think he's an Aquarius like me, so he had these weird fringe interests, and he figured out that I could enlighten him as to how magic works. But he kind of was too impatient for anything like that at all. But I hung out for him for a while in LA, and it was right after the single Radio had come out, and I really liked that song, so it was fortunate because I thought, oh, that's a great song. And then Robbie Williams got in touch, so I could actually say that's a great single. I still think it's one of his best. Yeah, we just became quite friendly with him for a while. We were getting him out of the house because he would read shit about himself on the internet and then spend all day in bed moping, and was really sensitive about that stuff. It was the sort of thing he shouldn't ever have done, but he did. He couldn't help himself, so he was quite miserable. So we got him out of the house a little bit. Yeah, it was fun. He used to come to our house and sing Morrissey songs on the guitar, and he's great singer, So we hung about for him for a bit. We did that record, and I brought Frank Whiteley in, and we created these sort of tarot cards for him that was kind of summing up his life and where he was and what was going on. And that was it. It was just, we passed through, we'd see him at gigs, went to Berlin, I hung about him for a couple of times backstage, and then passed through, and suddenly calls weren't answered and we were gone. He moved on to somebody else. So, but yeah, I liked him. I thought he was all right.
Well, I think there's a little bit of him in Jimmy Olsen, in where the way Frank drew Jimmy Olsen, right? And also Superman, there's a little bit Robbie in the sort of the face and the kind of the loudness.
Well, at the time he wanted to be a superhero, and I've got drawings where Frank's actually got him in a superhero suit, and he really looks. And then he did Jimmy Olsen's where he really looks like Robbie Williams. It was too much. It was almost a likeness, and he just used a little bit of it. But ultimately, for that album, rather than a superhero, because it was kind of, he wanted to be a superhero for the album, but we ended up, he became more like a shamanic, kind of Doctor Who figure, and I think that was the look, the doctor thing and intensive care got into his head. So I think that was his Doctor Who album for me. It was a strange one because it was the first album he did with Guy Chambers, so I think it was a bit of a leap in the dark for him.
Well, he's always had, I mean, my knowledge of Rob Williams is I only have so much knowledge, but like, I'm not like a deep fan. I don't know the deep cuts, but like, I know he always seems to me to have had a somewhat gonzo edge. He's always, in some ways, it's not a surprise that he teamed up with you guys, and you put the sigil on the front of the cover with it on his finger, the magic sigil, and the angel and the sort of the devil figures on his shoulders. He always seems to be very open to these kinds of ideas.
No, he is, and he was interested in a lot of things, but he also, one of the saddest things I heard him say was that, I'll go into cool people's houses and they never have Robbie Williams albums. No, Rob, come on. So he kind of felt that, and he felt that people didn't really recognize him as a songwriter and a lyricist, and I think he was pretty good at that. But he's right, the trouble is he was a pop figure. He came out of a boy band, and he was always kind of Jack the Lad, so he was kind of doomed to be the entertainer. And unfortunately, you wear the mask, don't you?
Totally. I mean, I think that leads into like, because I don't know if are you aware of Better Man, the Robbie Williams biopic, where they CGI he's a monkey.
I haven't seen it yet. I'm looking forward to it, but as I say, it kind of stops just before we meet him. So I was hoping there'd be a monkey version of me in.
Oh, that would be amazing. Because like I say, like he has got a sort of a very interesting sort of gonzo edge to him, and the idea that like so many pop stars have controlled their image. And so it's so sort of almost sterile and controlled, and especially when they get to a certain age, I think like you think of the Bohemian Rhapsody, the Queen film, and how that is very quite a controlled, sort of produced version of the band's story. And then you get to, but I confess I haven't seen Better Man. I heard it, but I know I know people have seen it and I've heard a lot about it, and it sounds like it's incredibly sort of open heart surgery kind of approach. Like he didn't hold anything back. I mean, the idea of CGI making him this sort of monkey figure was purely like, no, that's how it felt. I was a performing monkey, but also I was a sort of a bit of an animal. I was just an animal. Chaotic was the lifestyle, and making mistakes, and very honest, which I think is very different and unique in
He's
pop culture.
always been very vulnerable and very open. But, it kind of amuses me that he's always packed out stadiums and everyone's always loved him, but he's constantly vulnerable, he's constantly sad. So there's this real disconnect between the fact, I mean, he's not like a washed up star, really, he likes to sometimes pretend. But a lot of the stars kind of like that, don't they? They like the notion that they're really vulnerable and sad, and then they're selling out stadiums and having #1 albums.
I mean, so there's something else I'd like to touch on is because you talk going back to what we were talking about with like the films that you grew up with and the influences you had. Because I know that you've talked over the years about how your favorite film, which is Oh Lucky Man, the
Yeah.
Lindsay Anderson film, which is just a brilliant, brilliant film, and it's interesting because like you said, like you can see the influences on people like yourself and like your contemporaries like Moore and Milligan, and Oh Lucky Man was one of those experiences where like watching it, I was like, it makes sense, like because so much of this is straight for a film that is kind of slipped through the cracks, I think, by modern
Oh, yeah,
standards.
totally. Yeah.
Totally. I think like it's always been like a kind of like if you know, you know. I guess I just want to ask, like, what is it about that film that makes it your favorite, and like why? What is it that you think inspires you and influenced you from that film?
It covers everything is one of the things I felt. And the first time I saw it, I was, I guess, quite young. I was a teenager. And it felt like a dream. It felt like one of those amazing, long, involved dreams that you have where you come out of it feeling you've really discovered some essential truth about the universe. It was like one of those dreams. And the fact that it wasn't linear structure, the fact that he would seem to die and then be reborn and anything could happen. But then once I figured that it was this sort of version of Candide and it was a journey through life, it just played into everything I was into, and Malcolm McDowell was great in it. So I think the first thing I felt was this is like an amazing dream, but it's really harsh and it's one of those pieces of art, like, like the David Rudkin plays, where you're watching it and you're just, what the fuck did I just see? What was that? Wait, oh no, here's something worse. Here's another thing. And it had all that. It had this incredible imagination, and it just kept going. It's 3 hours long, so this is great. It just keeps going. It's like one of those dreams, and it goes to all these different places, and it touches in so many parts of society. So for me, it kind of said it all. And it's funny because I was thinking about this. I mean, I didn't even know you would bring this up, but I was thinking about the other day because I'm sort of reading things, and you see all these books about screenwriting and how it's done, but it's really only one method for creating one very narrow type of Hollywood movie. And I thought of all these films that I like, and none of them are like that. And I kind of thought, no, I like stuff that's not like that, and I've always sought out stuff that's not like that and found that it appeals to me more. So I guess I just like things that don't necessarily have the typical story where the good guy wins at the end or that gets the girl. I mean, I want something to feel like it's real, and even though I'll watch those films, the films that I really love are not that at all. It's Oh Lucky Man, it's things that are, you're not quite sure where the story ends and what's real. It's the dreamlike, the uncanny that's always appealed to me. I think all of the films I love, Don't Look Now, even things like that are all, it's a different atmosphere. It's not the endings people expect.
Totally. I mean, Oh Lucky Man. I mean, you think of like a typical 3-act screenplay in a Hollywood film, and Oh Lucky Man. I think
Yeah.
I don't. You could break it down to 3 acts, but it's really more like 5 or 6 or 7 acts. Like it's so freewheeling, and
But also they would give notes, and it would be, "What do you mean he's dead? How can he be dead?" And then he's back. Don't even give an explanation. What does he get? There'd be so many notes, there'd be no movie left, and yet that comes as 3 hours of just genius. I think.
totally. And it's a shame that it's so. I mean, like just anyone who's listening, who hasn't heard it or seen this film, like go check it out because it really is one of the great. I mean, it's one of my favorite films, one of my favorite British films. And I actually first, again, I've got to give credit where it's due. I mean, I first heard of this film through you and your work because in the liner notes for Arkham Asylum,
Yeah,
you described the final panel of Arkham's death, where he sort of he's on his back and he's like the last gasp, and then like he has this smile, and it's very much like the smile that Malcolm McDowell has when he's sort of breaking the fourth wall at the end of A Lucky Man, and it was like, and you talk about that so beautifully, and I was like, I've got to see this film. This sounds amazing. I've got to see this. And then like my dad was a big fan of the soundtrack, the Alan Price soundtrack,
Oh yeah, that's great as well.
which is incredible. Kind of Brechtian, kind of the breaking of the fourth wall,
Yeah.
and having the band in the movie like a Greek chorus, incredible. I saw this one, I was like, yeah, it blew my mind. And you're absolutely right. Like that film could never be made today at all. It could not be made
Yeah.
today.
And the other one like it for me is The Ruling Class. I don't know if you saw The Ruling Class.
I've heard of this. What, Peter O'Toole, right?
Oh my god, it's 3 hours and you got to see The Ruling Class. Those two for me are the ultimate peaks of things. You've seen everything's in it. It's like all that stuff that the Dennis Potter did where people are singing jazz band songs while somebody's been murdered. It's great.
I'll check it out. No, so my dad's just way cooler than me. He was like, yeah, you got to see this. You got Ruling Class. He talked about it at length. He loved it. It's interesting because when you talked about the structure of the film, for me, as a fan of yours and as someone who's read much of your work, there seems to be two different sort of disciplines in your work because you're a very disciplined writer. It seems to me in terms of like you're so knowledgeable about structure and about the craft of actually just building a comic or just crafting a story, and it is a craft. And I think of comics like All Star Superman, which is built around that sort of Joseph Campbell hero's journey of the sighing in the day, then moving into the night, and then the sun rises again in the day, in the day, and then also Arkham Asylum, structured around the tarot cards and like the meaning, the Jungian kind of psychology, and also Pax Americana, the issue of the Multiversity series you did with Frank Quietly, to that design around the harmonics of the 8-panel grids. So you're someone who seems to have such a sort of finger on the pulse of structure, but also you're someone who seems to embrace so much the chaos element. I mean, even going into the sort of the influence chaos magic I know has had on your life, like these stuff like the Invisibles and Action Comics and the kind of Final Crisis where you're sort of embracing kind of anti-structure, kind of like jazz, kind of like your it's fluid and it's freeform and it's chaotic and it's like, but somehow you craft legible stories and out of this stuff, which you can follow, and as a reader, you're still engaged and you're sort of emotionally you're taking care of the reader. I mean, this is a very sort of simplistic dichotomy of splitting these two approaches down the middle. But like, do you see yourself as someone who is like, okay, this now I'm going to sort of embrace the chaos, or this time, do you think of it as like when you're crafting a story, are you thinking about structure, like rigorous structure, or do you think of it as like, no, this time I'm going to go in the other direction?
Yeah, honestly, it's always project based. So, like you say, with Superman, okay, this is going to be very structured. With Action Comics, the notion was to have constant movement, like the first Action Comics, and just the characters are constantly moving forward from left to right. Those Doom Patrol issues where it was done as a recursive spiral. So it depends what the project is, and with Pact, because it was playing around with time as seen from a certain point of view outside the comic, then it was playing about with time in a very different way and kind of echoing those Watchmen things that it was kind of riffing with. So not always project specific, and something like Doom Patrol, it was like, okay, I'll just do this. But even in Doom Patrol, there were recursive issues, there were spiral things. There was always trying structures that hadn't been tried. So maybe that was the chaos element. I'd write a story based around a seance, or based around throwing tarot cards on the floor, or based around the Green Lantern. I did what my cat had died and I was miserable, and I couldn't come up with something, and I just thought, there's the clouds, there's the sky, there's a plane going by, and I wrote a story about a lost pet, but the pet's a cloud from another world. And so stuff like that's chaos, I guess, because you're just taking what you've got and trying to turn it into something. But it's the filter that comes through is always get some sense of order, or what is the structure of this? Is this circular? Is this flowing? Is this? There's never a purely random thing at all. I just don't know if I could do it that way.
But you don't seem when you sort of when you write a story, it seems to me that you're not intent on sort of showing off in a sense like how good you are at structure. Like the structure seems to me to be very much implicit in like the sort of the journey of Superman and All-Star Superman, or that is in there if you want to see it, but you don't have to be aware of it. Whereas I feel like there are some writers, particularly I think in comics, where you can be very ostentatious, if you like, with structure and panels commenting on each other and captions, kind of like that Watchmen style, I guess, where it's very self-reflexive and it's very sort of quite ostentatious, and it's brilliantly done, but it's quite, and it seems to me that you're more interested in kind of the more implicit inner workings of just like the mechanics are underneath the skin of the story.
Yeah. It was funny when I hung out with Dave McKean when we were doing Arkham Asylum, and we both had these Swatch watches, and I don't know if you remember these things from the late 80s, 90s, but they were kind of cheap, like fashion watches. and they all had really cool designs. Every one was a bit different, so you could buy some. So we all had Swatch watches. You could look them up, and that.
Are they like this? I've got a Swatch here. Is this not the same kind of thing?
Well, that'll be it. Are they still doing them? I'm just, I thought they were gone. Some vintage Unreality. Yeah, so this was the Swatch back in the day, and I noticed that Dave had a Swatch on and I had a Swatch on, and mine was completely white. Everything was white because the strap was white. It turned yellow in the end, but it was white plastic, and white hands, and no numbers on it. And Dave had the one, and it's every bit of the clockwork you could see through. It was transparent. You could see all the stuff and the workings. And I just thought that, well, that's how he does it, and this is how I do it. And yeah, it was always my English teacher. I just go back to him. Just said you hide the structure. You don't want it to be seen. You want it to be under there, like it's whirring away, and you don't know. And that might be right or wrong. There's, like, as you say, there's good stuff which makes a point of the structure, and we tried to do that with packs in our own way. But my favoured method is to hide it, and unfortunately you don't get the kudos for that because people don't notice it even a lot of times, and they'll just, it's chaotic, or you just threw this across the page, which is what I get quite often because I'll try weird structures now and again. But yes, for me the structure should be underlying and you shouldn't really know it, and it should be something strange, in the filth it's basically the curve of an illness and recovery. So I based it on that kind of temperature chart, and that's a very simple arc, but it's like Gravity's Rainbow is just based on the Aristotelian drama arc. So I'm thinking, okay, let's do that. So like that, there's always some underlying thing there, and I think for me it's that just the tension is between how much rational mind do I want this, how much irrational. And you can push it in one way or another, but there's always the tugging back to make sure it's anchored somewhere. Even Final Crisis, which people think is, it's chaotic. No, it was based on channel shifting techniques, so it's just it deliberately jumps like that. So there was always thoughts behind it, but as I say, unless you explain structure, I think you can't expect it to be noticed. It shouldn't be noticed. It shouldn't really, except by scholars.
I mean, that's it. I mean, ideally, when you're watching, whether you're reading a comic or reading a novel or a film, I guess like the ideal mindset the director or the creator is having is like, with the reader is like, you're not thinking about the structure, you're not thinking about you're not breaking it down and deconstructing it while you're reading it. It should just be absorbed in the story.
Exactly that, and you're leading people along in a certain way, and it tends to be narratively or with characters. So there are things that I wouldn't do on the screen because there's too much money involved, that I would certainly do on the comics page to break structure. And, someone will read something and go, "Why do I feel uncomfortable?" It's because I've wanted you to feel uncomfortable, and I'm sorry, maybe I should have explained. But there's that, they think they feel uncomfortable because it's written badly, because they want to feel comfortable. But, so certain things are done to make, there's tricks I've learned from reading other people's comics over many years, where if you do certain things with an image or a word, or you get really odd effects, and if you do it wrong, you get really interesting effects. So sometimes I will break, like I say, break frames or break structures just to give people a sense of disconcerting strangeness.
Well, that's how I felt reading. For me, like when I first read Final Crisis, for example, like I think the brilliance of that for me was the idea, like, so obviously as the crisis sort of develops and Darkseid, the big bad invades the DC universe reality, and everything kind of goes to hell, and then behind Darkseid you've got the vampiric sort of universe monitor, who's going to sort of drain the life force out of the DC universe. Just these incredible ideas and concepts, and then. But like, it's almost the way you presented it from like the gutter of like, you've got the detective, the Kirby detective from the Fourth World, tracking down, what happened to Orion? Why did I find him in like in a garbage dump, a skip, and then like finding it, and then sort of working your way up from the bottom to the top, and also, but also kind of framing it like almost like in as news, as media, because I remember the title pages of like each issue would be almost like the sort of banner of like a news broadcast, like, and then as things get more chaotic and fragmented, as the news can't keep up. And people can't keep up, and it just becomes this sort of chaotic as the whole of reality kind of falls apart, which in some ways is not similar to how it feels right now.
Yeah, because exactly. And suddenly you turn around and people are working on production lines and making Justifier helmets, and it's die on the job to die for Darkseid. And it's because all of a sudden it becomes like that. And I wanted to show that's kind of how these things happen. It's not the easy process people might imagine. It's just suddenly you're in it, and you realise what's been going down, and it's too late.
touching you because you mentioned Dave McKean there and the Swatch story. I mean, we actually had Dave on the podcast a little while ago.
Oh, well, yeah.
Yeah, and he was great. He was talking about primarily about his film career, but we touched on. I mean, I couldn't help I had to ask about Arkham Asylum because Arkham Asylum was actually my favorite comic of yours, and
Yeah.
maybe my favorite ever, if I'm just being honest. But like, that is such a unique take. I think still in superhero comics, it's such a unique take on a character as iconic as Batman, the abstract, the surreal. Whereas most takes on that character in superheroes are very realistic and sort of, I emphasize the noir and the gritty and the crime, and it's it's Wells and it's Hitchcock, and then with that, you were like, yeah, no, this is like Svankmajer, this is Lynch, this is like all these other. I mean, and it still feels like there's precious few. I can barely think of any stories and comics that are, sort of went as far as you guys did, creating a kind of art house Batman.
Yeah.
I mean, like, and is that something that I just wanted to ask, like, what's your relationship to that comic right now and all this time later? I mean, I guess it kind of was one of the things that put you on the map at the time, right? Is that fair to say?
Oh, it really did. It was the first time it made me actual money. I mean, Karen Berger phoned me up, and it was a shared phone in the flat that I was staying in with a bunch of people. And the phone was in the hallway, and suddenly Karen Berger's on said, "You're rich." And so we'd got $1 a copy, and it sold 120,000 copies in the first day. And suddenly, oh, this was great. I was able to buy a house and do stuff and go around the world several times, because I took David Bowie's advice, and he said, if you ever get money, go around the world. If you ever get money. So I did that, and it changed my life completely. But I've had a weird up and down relationship with it because the backlash was so heavy on that book, and I felt as if I'd been burned. Really, I felt quite bad about it for a while. But my current position is I love it. I've gone back to why it was made and why it was different, and embraced all of those things. And I think it's great. It's the Euro art house take on Batman, and I think it's why it was so popular outside the fan base, because the fans kind of really resented it and rebelled against it. I mean, not everyone, obviously, but there was a kind of swell of, this isn't the Dark Knight, this isn't Killing Joke, what the hell is this? Batman's a pussy, Batman barely gets into a fight. A woman beats him, and it wasn't that at all. So looking back on it now, I realise we totally hit the mark, and it's why it's been so successful. I think it's certainly been more successful outside the comic. It's the one that directors have always read, or art people and architects have got on their shelf. So it seemed to reach out to very much the audience that I guess we were trying to bring to the comics, and to say, look, we can also do a Batman that's like those sources you say, like Svankmajer, like Brothers K, or the David Lynch thought, a lot of the European directors, the surrealist directors I was watching at the time, and Kenneth Anger and stuff like this. There was a lot of things that were feeding into it, and Cocteau was another big influence. So looking back now and seeing, we actually made this, and we made this in 1989, and it was, I think it's still kind of ahead of its time, and it's still unlike anything else. So I'm pretty proud of it now. I'm pleased with it. I've made my peace, and anything I ever said bad about Arkham Asylum, I take back.
Well, as you should, mate, because like that really was for me. Like, because it's interesting that you mentioned how it was it wasn't well received by the fans, but it kind of brought outside people into the media, into sort of got them into reading comics, and that was how it felt to me. I mean, I had always been a comics fan, but really, first encountering that comic, it was like, because essentially when I was rereading Super Gods, you talk about the Flash. There's an issue of the Flash 163, I think, from the 60s, where Flash is that finger breaking the fourth wall, and he's reaching out to the reader. It's like, stop, buy this issue now, or my life depends on it.
Love that comic.
Incredible comic. I know you talked very eloquently about how that was kind of a real sort of touchstone for you. It became a sort of origin story in some way. Some of the ideas that you have, it was very inspirational for the ideas that you have about the medium, about breaking the fourth wall and metafiction, and I can honestly say it was a similar thing for me with Arkham Asylum, not in the same way of like, I guess, the fourth wall, but just like a contact with something that was just completely, you have no reference point for. And it's like, what the hell is this? And it was brilliant. But I'm curious, because I know that, because having read the script and the liner notes that are present in the book, they're quite different from the finished comic. And from what I understand, Dave came on board and sort of took the script and basically ran with it. This is like, I'm gonna strain this through my prism of my artwork. Is that how it happened?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it started as a 48-page script, and I'd done all these little thumbnails that are in the back of some editions. And just in my usual style, basic comic drawings, and I'd imagine somebody like Gary Leach doing it. So I did imagine a kind of Killing Joke that they would carry on and do one of those, with a comic book with a spine kind of thing, and that it would be very much in that format. And then Dave came on board and he wanted to make it longer. So I wrote the script to 64 pages, which he then did as 120 pages. And yeah, but the collaboration, I don't think it would be it'd probably still be okay in some way, but it just wouldn't be what it was. It wouldn't be what it is now. It had to be Dave McKean, there was just no getting by it. And there's no one else in the world that could even have approached that, aside from maybe a Bill Sienkiewicz or a Baron Story at the time. So no, it had to be Dave, and I think even the fact that he has that on his resume and he's done so much more, and he's obviously done things that he was a lot more interested in. It's a really good one to have a Batman that's like unlike any other Batman, because Batman is the great cultural figure of the early 21st century, in pop culture certainly. So I think to have that, and for both of us, it's yeah, I like Arkham Asylum. I love Big Brother.
Well, it's interesting talking to Dave about it, because Dave, like you say, Dave's done so much. I mean, you both have. I mean, so much since then, so much. The careers you guys have had is extraordinary. But like, his career, he's moved into like music. I mean, he's always been into jazz, I know, but like film and album artwork and prose, the illustration, that kind of thing. He's not particularly precious about any of the work that he's done. He's very much a guy who's like, okay, I've done the work. It's in the past. Time to move on. But I remember I kind of collared him about Arkham. So I was like, because obviously as a fan, I was like, I've got to, what's the relationship? I asked him the same question, like, what's the relationship like to it now? And it was nice, because normally I think he'd just done a big compilation book with his own art, like a big absolute edition of his art. And it was the first time he'd ever revisited any of his stuff, really, because he's very much like moving ahead. But then he'd always been, I think, like you say, at the time, maybe he was a bit embarrassed because he wasn't a Batman aficionado. He just came on board to do the story. But then,
we got a hard time as well, so I think he must have felt that too,
But like I remember when I asked him about it, he was like, you know what? And he was like, you know what? I actually because he'd reviewed a lot of the materials, the original drawings and the prep that he'd done for the comic when putting together this sort of retrospective, and he actually was like, you know what? This is actually pretty good. Yeah, so that was nice. I think that's the best I could get out of him. But he was like, yeah, I'm not. He seemed to be seemed positive about it, which was nice. I mean,
it's time for a retrospective. I was going to write something again, but I'll get around to it.
Yeah, I mean, have you guys ever? Because I think that's the only work you guys have done together. Did you guys ever talk about doing something else, or was it really much just like a moment in time? It's like that was what it was.
No, there was that, but we did a 16-page story for a book called Phobias. It was DC's Piranha Press imprint, and Dave and I did this, and it was honestly, I've got to say this, it was a pitch perfect Alan Bennett Talking Heads. And it's just a librarian. It's the opposite of the Batman thing. It's 16 pages. It's like a 12-panel grid of just a librarian talking to camera. This middle-aged woman she's from Leeds. And it's just done as a kind of Alan Bennett monologue, and it's really good. And that was the only other thing we did, and people don't even know that we did it.
Oh, I mean, hands up, I didn't even know. So I'll check that out. But like,
yeah, it's called A Glass of Water. You should check it out if you can.
Okay, yeah, well, and have you guys stayed in touch since those days? Have you ever talked about?
Anytime I see Dave, I get on with him. But no, I mean, we've met up at conventions. Probably it's been years actually since we last met. But yeah, we get on, but we haven't talked about doing anything else. I mean, I certainly wouldn't drag him back to Arkham Asylum 2, which I've threatened many times.
That's right. I remember you've talked about this. I mean, yeah, you're doing a follow-up in some form.
Well, I like the idea of it's last gasp, jump the shark kind of thing. And there'll come a moment where I'll just say, that's it, I'm doing Arkham Asylum 2. But I'd come up with a great notion and a way of doing it in a completely different way. But honestly, I think it's still just a great notion. I don't know if I'll ever go back there again.
Well, I think you're one of those writers where some of your sort of unreleased or unfinished comics are as sort of famous as some of your finished one. So like, I mean, I remember sticking with Arkham Asylum, I remember for a long time you were talking with Simon Bisley about doing a Spider-Man comic kind of in the style of Arkham Asylum, and that's but approaching it from as that Ditko sort of Spider-Man, and approaching it as like a sort of unpicking that sort of the neuroses of that sort of classic Ditko Spider-Man and getting under the skin of that. Was that sort of the idea?
That was the idea at the time, but then we had martial law, which did the same thing in such a vicious and mean-spirited way that you couldn't possibly top it. Pat Mills and Kevin O'Neill's kind of eviscerations of superhero archetypes are really great. It's not the way that I'd want the world to go, and it kind of has gone that way, but they're really funny.
That was kind of the direction you were thinking of, because I know there is a Spider-Man kind of facsimile in there, and he's
No, it was going to be Steve Ditko's Spider-Man meets the modern Spider-Man who's married to a supermodel and's got a great job, and suddenly they get the option, could I switch places with this guy? Nobody would know, and it's showing that no, with power comes responsibility. So it was kind of showing that original creepy Spider-Man to still have the same, the good heart and the responsibility that Spider-Man's always had.
Yeah, and that creepy, like kind of posed in those very Ditko kind of like sort of strange, bizarre sort of like.
It was weird where he kind of looks like a human swastika all the time, and he's kind of broken. those kind of images though, with Spider-Man was really skinny and weird in the early days. Yeah, I'm back to the fourth wall. I should probably wrap up soon, but yeah, I'm doing this Batman Deadpool thing, so it's the only comic I agreed to do in the last few years, and they said, "Do you want to do this Batman Deadpool?" And I said, "Yeah, sure, I've got to do this." Because it goes right back to my Animal Man stuff in the fourth wall, and so it's coming out at the end of the year. Marvel are doing their own, so it's the first DC Marvel crossover in since the 90s, I think, or the early 2000s, and they're doing a Deadpool Batman, and we're doing Batman Deadpool. It's clever. It's how you tell them apart. So I just agreed to it because I really liked the films, and I had this idea instantly to pick up on some threads that I dropped like 30 years ago. So yeah, that's coming out at the end of the year. And Marvel's one comes out first, and then this one comes out afterwards. And there's a whole bunch of different character strips in there as well. So different Marvel DC characters. So it's a kind of anthology thing.
Fantastic. So I know, it's been a while since you've done a Marvel character, since like the early noughties with New X-Men and Skull Kill Crew and Nick Fury and that Fantastic Four, like 1, 2, 3, 4. So this is like you're sort of dipping your toe back into those waters.
Well, just because they asked for this one, and I had an idea, but I don't know if I'll do anything else. I can't come up with anything else that I really want to do right now. But sometimes they'll just hit me with something like this.
Yeah. In a way, like Deadpool is almost like a perfect Grant Morrison. I can't believe this hasn't happened sooner, because obviously the 4-4 stuff, but also just the language and the sort of hyper violence. It could almost be out. He's a character that I guess could almost have walked out of the Invisibles in some ways.
I've always got that little bit. Being raised a pacifist, there's also a lunatic with a sword in my psyche somewhere. So it's nice to have an outlet for that kind of thing. And I do like this sarcastic, kind of culturally literate kind of anti-hero thing. I've always liked that, so I had great fun doing that one.
And that's a voice that's kind of become almost all too prevalent in today's like culture. That the Ryan Reynolds, the Deadpool. I think that is obviously the role is identified with the most. But that voice of the snarky, rolling your eyes kind of at everything, and sort of everything is kind of. I think it's something that people are actually sort of reacting against it now. We've had so many years of quippy characters and superheroes that now, people are now give us sort of open-hearted sincerity.
Yeah, sincerity is needed, and you've got Batman in this, fortunately, and he's a completely different counterpoint than Wolverine. It's quite funny. Batman's a totally different character.
Well, he's a character who has no sense of humor, typically, I guess, about himself. Unless you go back to the 60s or the 50s, typically he's a guy who's pretty, serious. And so like a guy.
That's almost his power when it comes to Deadpool.
Oh, that sounds fantastic.
That's been fun. Just doing something like that was again something that's kind of in the zeitgeist that I could grab a hold of and do something with.
So going back to Supergods, which is the end. Supergods kind of ends with you've just taken over Action Comics. There's a new age of DC Comics on the way. The first Avengers movie is on the horizon. It's the cusp of kind of the absolute total kind of explosion of the superhero phenomenon, and sort of the beginning of what became, I guess, superheroes winning the culture war. Like Marvel became the biggest thing on the planet. The Avengers was like in the top 3. The Endgame was the biggest gross movie of all time. They became kind of the monolith, and I guess. And at the end of the book, there's so much optimism that you put into the book about how Wentz could go. This could lead to kind of an Aquarian kind of society. If we emphasize these principles and these ideas, these very positive human ideals, we could sort of move towards that. And I guess going back to something I touched on earlier, like now that we're sort of 15 years on, what is sort of your attitude to that superhero phenomenon now that it's here and it's won the culture? Because do you feel because people talk about superhero fatigue and have done for a while now. I mean, and like people are sort of maybe almost a little bit tired of superheroes. I don't know if they are, but like, what's your feeling on it now that we're sort of 15 years beyond that point of them, that cusp of them exploding?
I think it just is it's easy to understand. People are not necessarily fatigued with superheroes, but with how they've been presented. And kind of the Ultimates has been the template for most superhero films since the Ultimates came out 25 years ago. And it's that notion of let's keep it grounded, let's show kind of how this would happen, let's show Batman in tactical gear and how he gets his stuff. So there was a focus on that that's gone through almost everything. I mean, there's been a few breakouts, like the Thor movies have slightly gone a bit more colourful and some of that stuff. But I think what you're seeing now is like actually starting to see movies that are like comics, a bit more like the comics that people remember. So I think Superman's a lot more colourful and there's a lot more kind of outlandish ideas. The Fantastic Four's coming out next, presenting this kind of world of tomorrow, and 60s pioneer world. So to me, it's just any fatigue there is can be cured by just doing the next great film, and you could do, if they want to do the ultimate dark end of things, do Moore's Marvel Man, Miracle Man, and just take it all the way, and that's the end game, and that ends with a kind of utopia, So if you want to take the realistic superhero, that's where I would take that as the final end game. And for the rest of it, there's other ways of doing superheroes, do Dan Clow's Death Ray comic, which is like a total slacker hipster version of superheroes, or do my Sea Guy, which is post-apocalyptic, like superheroes when superheroes are just TikTokers and influencers and there's nothing left but people pretending to be somebody important. So there's always a new way of doing it that's got something to say. It's just, I think we've got fed up with that kind of, well, here's what they'd be like if they were real, which was always a dead end. They're not real. They're never going to be real, for God's sake. It's like the unreality of them was what makes them great. Bringing them down to earth is ultimately ends with the boys. And it's like, well, ultimate power corrupts, absolutely. Superman would be Homelander. But no, as I said, the genius of Superman and Batman is that they're not like that. And they resist that. They're superheroes. And you have to get your head around that rather than change them into what you think you would be like if you had superpowers. Because you're dealing with people who operate in a higher order than you. Obviously, if you think the first thing I do if I get superpowers is become a total bastard, So that ain't the superhero story, so you're already getting it wrong. So I think there's been a lot of playouts of, okay, if they were real, this is what it would be like. But the minute we stop saying, what if they were real, and stop, that's a dumb question. It was a dumb question when Watchmen asked it, and it's still a dumb question. And you can get interesting art out of it, but I think we've seen it all now, And it's not about, they're real in the sense that they're outlandish creations of the imagination that can interact with us, and that's all the reality they need. And as I always say, Superman's more real than me or you. Superman was created in 1938 before either of us, and will outlast our lifetimes. So who's real here?
That's it. Well, I mean, it's like you say, Superman's the original foundation stone of the DC universe, and Fantastic Four is of the Marvel universe. And now we've got these two movies coming out. It could be, I guess, it could be something new. It could be, we'll have to see. I mean, maybe it'll be a new phase, or it could be, who knows?
It will depend on how people react, but I think they're probably correct to intuit that people don't want the super dark superhero anymore, because the super dark superhero kind of failed us, It was like, as much as I enjoyed the Zack Snyder Justice League thing, it wasn't my aesthetic at all. But he's such a dedicated filmmaker. I really appreciated the world that he'd created. But it just had no hope to offer. It really had nothing. It was, Darkseid wins, Superman's corrupted ultimately, is what it's, there's a feeling of everybody's gone mad or lost their money or lost their kit. So I think that was too close to home for people. So I'll be interested to see now if they do dial up the colours and say, look, this is never going, this comes from a world where this stuff is real, and you just have to buy it. You have to buy into Crypto the Superdog and stop asking yourself how this could possibly happen, because it can never happen except in a story. And once you understand that, then the characters in the story can be inspiring. Like they are when you were a kid and you were reading fairy tales. The characters inspired you. They didn't have to be real. Puss in Boots doesn't have to be real to make kids feel brave and swashbuckling. So I think we, as an adult audience, need to get back to stop trying to imagine what would it be like if they were real, that will never happen. That's an insane question to ask. It's like, what would happen if unicorns ran the banking system? It would probably fall apart, wouldn't it? Do you really want to waste your time pursuing that question in a series of films?
Well, we know the answer, yeah. And I guess, like, we said right at the start, like, hope and optimism, which seems to be what Superman is so much in the DNA, and what James seems to be doing, highlighting in the movie and maybe in the FF movie, is like, it's almost punk. It's like, say, it's a provocative act, which it shouldn't be the case, but like, I guess
no,
it is.
It shouldn't be, but it's, as a strategy, it's now worth trying. It's now worth getting really aggressive with it and shoving it in people's faces. It's like shake hands until your hand falls off.
Because we've had so much of the other thing. So much.
They had enough. Everyone's sick of it. So just, I think, to try something different and see if it works.
Just give it a go. Great. Well, thank you so much for your time, Grant. And thank you for sticking around. I can't believe it. Yeah, we went an hour.
No, that was fun. We've got a lot of material there, so I'm sure you can figure out what's good and bad.
Absolutely. Oh, I think it was all good. I mean, and for me personally, like I say, like, I've been a fan of yours for so many years, since I was a kid, and like, this really was a bit of it. Like, when I first created this podcast like years ago, your name was on the list of like, oh, that would be great people. It was just great to talk to, people who I'm a huge fan of. And thank you so much. Like,
that was great. I really enjoyed that, Billy. Thank you.
Cool. All right, guys. Well, have a good rest of your day, and enjoy the Superman movie. I'm curious to know.
Yeah, you too. If you see it this weekend or any other weekend, enjoy it.
Cool. All right.
See you, man. See ya.
See you, man. Take care. Hey guys, thanks so much for tuning into part 2 of my chat with Grant Morrison. An extra special thanks to everyone who's been commenting on and sharing the podcast online, and for saying such lovely things about the show. Stay tuned for more exciting interviews and guests coming very soon on Half the Picture.